Today's episode is going to be a great one with my special guest, Jonathan Rauch. He is the author of the book Cross Purposes Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. If you like today's conversation as we talk about Christianity and religion and politics, then you're going to love this book as well. So feel free to check it out. Link in the description. Welcome back to the Purple Political Breakdown. How's it going? How's your day been? We are back at it again with another special episode with a special guest. Now, this conversation is going to focus more on religion and the way religion is used in current politics. And I do think that's an appropriate conversation, especially considering what recently is taking place, what Donald Trump is trying to do with Christianity and potential agency he's trying to create. We might talk about that in a bit. But in order to have this conversation, I'm by no means an expert. So I brought in a great guest to have this conversation with, and Jonathan Rauch. So I'm allowing him to introduce himself. Tell you guys what he's about, and endorse the material he's working on as well. Go for it.
Well, hi, it's nice to be here, Radel. My name's Jonathan. I am a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, which is a think tank in Washington, the oldest in the country, I think the world. I am a contributing writer for The Atlantic. I am a journalist by trade and the author of, I guess you'd say an average of 8 books. My latest book, and the reason I'm with you today, is called Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. It comes out of my work trying to figure out why we're having such a hard time governing ourselves in America and getting along with each other, and thinking that the decline of Christianity has a lot to do with it.
Okay, I would be very interested in diving into what you mean by the decline of Christianity. Can you tell more about, like, this is important to really see where you're coming from as we discuss the topics? I typically ask this for every guest. What is your political background? What is your affiliation? How did you get into where you are in the spectrum? Can you explain that?
I'm a political independent, and I guess you could call me mildly right of center a little bit, but pretty much a centrist and very much a moderate by temperament, but a militant moderate, not an apologetic moderate. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. Born in 1960, I lived in eyeshot of Barry Goldwater's house and next door but one to Sandra Day O'Connor. So there were some pretty major conservative figures when I was growing up. My main political commitment is to what's sometimes called liberalism or classical liberalism, meaning not the progressive left-wing type of liberalism that became how the word's used in post-war America, but meaning the tradition of the founding fathers, that all people are born free and equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights.
Right, very interesting. So before we kind of, like I said, get in the nitty gritty, this is another question I'm very curious to be asking people. Before the current administration, I never really asked, even though I did always ask, do I think we are the most divided ever? At this point, it's just an objective reality that this is not as bad as like the war, but this is a very tensious. There's a lot of tension between the two political sides, and there's a lot of tension amongst the sides themselves. So there's just a lot of division in terms of political conversations, where any political conversation at this point anybody has can be extremely toxic. So instead of asking that opinion, because I think that's pretty self-explanatory, what is your overall opinion on the current political climate and this current administration going?
Well, that's a big question, and that's really 2 questions. One is the political climate, and the other is the current administration. The political climate is, I think you got it right, Riddell. It's not good. It's very divided. There's a phenomenon that political scientists call affective polarization. The normal kind of polarization, which is not necessarily a bad thing, is when people disagree about issues, taxes too low, too high, government too big, too small, abortion, that kind of thing. That's issue polarization. Affective polarization is different, and that's when people come to fear and hate the other side. It's emotional polarization. It's not about issues. So, in fact, the sides can switch positions on the issues, and it won't matter because they'll still think the other side is a threat to the country, dishonest, immoral. And that's where we are right now. There's been a rapid increase in affective polarization. It's just taken off in the last few years, 10 years, but especially since Donald Trump came along, because he's such a divisive figure. And that's making the country very hard to govern. The state of the administration right now is a full-scale assault on the Constitution as we've known it.
Right. Yeah, I'm with you. Even put a terminology behind it, affective polarization, which is, I mean, it perfectly explains the current situation and how divisive we are. And obviously, there's a lot of layers and a lot of factors, but what is undeniable, regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, is that Donald Trump's is a major factor on the way things are in terms of the division between multiple parties and multiple different types of people on the spectrum. With that said, let's dive into it. So you mentioned the decline of Christianity. I'm very interested to hear more on what that means necessarily and how we can potentially improve that in a effective manner in the United States.
Again, that's two questions, and they're both big questions. So maybe the logical place to start is just with what's happened. And maybe even before I do that, just a further word of background about me. Does that sound like it makes sense?
Yeah, go ahead, go for it.
So I'm not a Christian. I am a Jew, but I don't believe in God. I've been an atheist for as long as I can remember, and I'm gay. So I have always been an outsider to Christianity, and growing up understood it to be very hostile to people like me. So where I'm coming from is a long journey of evolution from really being quite hostile, antagonistic toward religion, to coming to see that it, and especially Christianity, have an important role to play in our civic life, and that when Christianity and liberal democracy get misaligned, it's just harder to do everything. So what's happened? In the latter half of the 20th century, we began to see a steady decline in the membership of what are sometimes called the mainline churches or the ecumenical churches. And these are, the Episcopalian Church of America and the United Methodists and the Lutherans, the churches that most people were members of when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s. They began losing to members. Sociologists say that's because they started blending in with the surrounding culture. They lost their distinctiveness. They were no longer as anchored in scripture. They became about doing good deeds and politics in that sense, and people wandered off. But then the story was that their loss was evangelical churches' gain. Now, here we're talking about white evangelicals, which is really the subject and audience of my book. So in the last century, the white evangelical church really took off. It did great. And people said this shows what an exceptional country America is. It's more religious than other developed, wealthy democracies. What we didn't know is that the 21st century would bring a dramatic change. It's called the Great De-Churching. 40 million Americans have gone from being churchgoers to never entering a church in between just 2008 and 2022. That's more people leaving the church than came in during all three of the Great Awakenings. Church membership was at 70% of Americans were members of a church from the World War II period when polling begins right through the end of the 20th century, and then it drops like a stone. So now less than half of Americans are members of a church. The percentage of American adults who identify as Christian dropped a percentage point a year over a 15-year period, and all those people went to the so-called nuns, people with no religious affiliation. So Christianity has just fallen off a cliff, and where these numbers are coming from includes not just the mainline churches, but the evangelical churches. They're now facing collapse as well. This is, Riddell, this is an unprecedented change in American life. We have never seen secularization of this kind and at such a pace. Meanwhile, while that's been going on, lots of social indicators have gone the wrong direction. The country has been safe and for the most part prosperous. Of course, terrible crash in 2008. Yet loneliness, isolation, disconnectedness, polarization, anger, depression, anxiety, all of those indicators have been on the rise. And of course, there's lots of reasons for that. You can talk about cell phones and social media and whatnot. But it seems pretty clear that as religious observance has collapsed, that nothing has come along to replace it that creates the same sense of community and gives people that same sense of identity and meaning that they can get from worshiping an eternal being. And in particular, the collapse of white Protestantism seems to have diverted a lot of those energies of trying to thinking about life in larger terms to politics. So people are now bringing religious zeal into politics, which politics is supposed to be about bargaining and negotiating, right? Forming coalitions, doing the best you can. It's not supposed to bear the weight of apocalyptic conflict over good and evil. So I'm left saying, boy, did I get that wrong? I thought secularization would make us more peaceful and harmonious. The opposite has happened.
There's a lot of very interesting points you made there, and like taking to the full context of how you were explaining things. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I agree with. Now, for me personally, I consider myself agnostic. Not mainly because I find at this point in my life the value of proving or disproving the existence of God and who who is not Jesus doesn't mean much to me personally. And I think that when it comes down to these conversations, I completely understand the value of religion to other people, which is why I don't ever try to convince them otherwise. I think that's unfair to do that to those people. And because of the reasons you mentioned, the idea of community, the idea of meaning, and the fact that you brought up the fact that society was becoming more safe and more prosperous, but like you said, a lot of people are becoming more depressed. Mental illness is on the rise. I won't discount, and I do think it is a major factor, the addition of social media, the addition of technology that also makes people's lives easier. So there's a lot more time to think about one's own self, in addition to the fact that they have no kind of core value that is implemented on them, especially if there's no cultural foundation instilled in the family. And also, I also bring this part of the equation as well. The introduction of, self-made content creators, I do think plays a part as well. Mainly the reason I say this is because there are people who look like the average person becoming very successful, very wealthy, being showcasing this glamorous lifestyle without being, I'm gonna be honest, relatively skilled. They aren't really doing anything that is that different. Of course, you got the Mr. Beast, very genius, business savvy, but he's not the norm. He's like the top of the top. There's a lot of people getting a lot of views, a lot of money, who are just doing dumb pranks or just reacting to content. They look like me and you. That's why I think I can do that too. And then there's just like, why am I not that successful? So a lot of these factors play with each other, creating this current climate of people, but a potential hole that can be filled, which is why, like I said before, I don't discount religion, and I actually think it's very valuable, can be religion for people, can be Christianity for people, especially in America. That's the number one religion, of course. So that is very interesting. However, you mentioned that your conclusion potentially could not be right, or at the very least, doesn't seem like it's foolproof. That's a better way to say it in terms of secularism. What do you mean by that? Do you think that secularism, or do you think that religion can be implemented into government and politics to an extent that can help? How do you see that?
Well, I go back to the founding fathers on this topic, and something that it took me a long time to realize is that they were right in one of the warnings that they gave us very clearly when they bestowed the US Constitution and the founding ideas on us. Washington, Adams, Franklin, others, Madison, they all warned us that they were giving us the structure of a democratic republic, but that they were not providing what they called Republican virtues, which are the habits of mind that are necessary to sustain a democracy. And those are things like respect for law, respect for truth, respect for each other, making sure to be a well-informed citizen, showing forbearance in politics if you lose. You don't try to drive the other side out of the country. And they told us that we'd have to get that from civil society. And that, of course, means the family, and it means community and community organizations. But of course, it also meant Christianity. And in their day, it meant particularly Protestant Christianity. So they were not saying America is a Christian nation and that John or Riddell has to be a Christian in order to be a good citizen, or that the Constitution is a Christian document. Nothing like that. They actually debated whether to include references to Jesus and Christianity in the Constitution and rejected that. And there was actually a controversy about that. A lot of people were very unhappy about that decision. So I'm not saying it's a Christian nation. What I am saying is that implicitly, the founders assigned a task to Christianity, and it said, look, you guys need to do the work of acculturating people, socializing people into these Republican virtues, so that we can then bring those into the political sphere, into the civic sphere, and have a basis for running the country, for common harmony and negotiation, for working out our conflicts. And it's not a formal requirement, of course, but it was something that they thought was going to be necessary. It didn't even necessarily have to be Christianity, but they thought that some kind of transcendent account had to come into it. So you fast forward to today, and what you find is that white Protestantism, especially evangelicalism, has become a force that's very divisive. It's highly politicized. It's very closely aligned with the Republican Party, so it's become very partisan. Pastors don't like it. They want to be teaching the gospel of Jesus, but a lot of people in the churches are saying, in the pews, are saying, we're losing the culture wars. We're endangered. Our country is changing. We've got to fight, fight, fight. One pastor I talked to called it the battlefield mindset. And that's heightening the very same divisions we talked about earlier, affective polarization. So the bottom line here, sorry if I took a little too long getting to it.
No, you're fine.
Our democracy, our system works better when Christianity is aligned with our liberal democracy than when they're pulling in opposite directions. And when they're pulling in opposite directions, it gets much harder to do everything else.
When I take into the full context of like how I perceive people living their lives and what moral values that they create, when it comes down to the founding fathers and their inclination, based off what you said at the very least, I'm not well versed in that particular part of history. When it talks about Christianity and its implementation, I understand why they would at the very least allude to that, because there's no alternative. I mean, back in the day, everybody's religious or a form of religious foundation. It's kind of unbelievable thinking that religion is not the end all be all at that point. Moral values beyond that is blasphemy. Now we obviously fast forward and people have become, like you said, they've been de-churched. They've been moving away from religion, or some people are able to create moral values, but in the grand majority of people, I would say they are not able to create something concrete for themselves. So the way I'm going to logically kind of like connect pieces, for me at the very least, in my perception, and people could disagree, that's fine, is that religion is the easiest way to create good morals for people. That's my perception of this. Because you can always allude to things, one, from a document that everybody trusts, the Bible, and two, an entity that nobody denies, God. If I created a moral framework based on pure logic, and now I've created that for myself, but if I try to explain it to another person, regardless of how much I make sense objectively, it still won't resonate to a large amount. It just won't, because it doesn't hit in the soul. That's the easiest way to put it. So I definitely see the logic of, the value of Christianity and how it can really help a grand majority of people, especially like the working class, the lower middle class, the poor class, in a situation when a lot of them are not living these fruitful lives, find meaning beyond what is going on in front of them. Of course, the fear is people using that undeniable belief and loyalty and faith against them and turning them into very culty, best way to put it. So when you talk about the value of Christianity and what it can do for people, which I very much understand, don't get me wrong, is there that fear that it can be used as a weapon if it's like instilled in so many families? And I mean, we can honestly relate it to how it's being used right now, but we'll save that for a little bit later. Do you believe that fear is enough of a reason to move away from religion when it comes to the
Oh,
value?
well, you put all of that very well, Riddell. You kind of put me out of a job here because that was so articulate. But of course, just because something is religious doesn't make it good. And down through history, the opposite has very often been the case. As many listeners will know, slavery was justified by many Christians and is found in the Bible. The suppression of women's rights, same thing to this day, still in a lot of conservative Christian communities. And I'm gay, right? So I literally, on a Sunday morning, could not spin the dial, the AM radio dial in my car, without hearing some preacher talk about how homosexuals were a stench in God's nostrils that were condemning our entire country. So the last thing that I would want to say is that anything that calls itself Christian or religious is good. And the Christianity, and for that matter, religion, cannot be a force for dogma, hypocrisy, and cruelty, because it has been, and throughout history, it's been a problem. So this goes back to the point I was making a couple paragraphs ago. It turns out that Christianity and liberalism, secular liberalism, need each other and improve each other, because Christianity provides a sense of transcendence and identity, something that's larger than ourselves. It provides a forum for community and worshiping as a community. It provides a system for educating kids in values. And of course, it provides the scripture itself, which, as we'll discuss in a few minutes, I hope, has some very important things to say. But it can go way off the rails, and historically it has. Liberal secularism, which is what I am, can provide things like orderly ways to work out our disputes, the rule of law. It can provide science, which is what brings knowledge, and things like the COVID vaccine. You can't manage society without it. And it also has brought the advance of human rights. Liberalism, that's the kind we're talking about, the founders' kind, is the force that has been the cause of the steady advance for 300 and 400 years of that core notion that all persons are created equal and endowed by their creator. Note, they added that, with certain inalienable rights. So that's come from our liberal tradition, and they need each other. Each one can go off track if it is not assisted by the others. Liberalism can't provide all its own values, and religion doesn't necessarily respect the rights of others. So these things are like, imagine a pair of sticks or planks. They won't stand up by themselves, but if you lean them against each other, they will stand. That's what the founders had in mind, and it's still true.
Yeah, there is something potentially interesting there if they can work in alliance with one another, of course. And I'm thinking about the types of people I've met throughout, not only discussing politics, but in real life connections. And I'm thinking about the people who embraced, obviously, religion and embraced a level of liberalism as well. And I mean, I always respected those people. Those people are the people that I felt like had a strong foundation in the things that they're preaching. And I mean, they made also scripture attractive, right? I mean, I've actually grew up Christian because all my family is Christian. They forced me to go to church. I kind of had to. But there was a lot to gain from this. I am curious. You said there's scripture that can be very, helpful, influential, and I know for a fact there is a lot of good ones. I mean, you were actually referring to one just a second ago. Can you kind of talk about that a bit?
Well, glad you asked. Excuse the cough. So there's plenty in the Bible to to cause dismay. For example, the condemnations of homosexuality. But the core teachings of Christianity, as explained to me by Christians, are three basic principles. And I'll say what they are, but the reason I mention them is they're all right there in the teachings of Jesus, just flashing red lights, and they're all true, and they all align with the teachings of James Madison and the founders. They're very similar to the precepts that liberal democracy is organized on. And that means that you don't have to be a Christian to believe them. So what are they? Number one, don't be afraid, the most frequently repeated injunction in the Christian Bible. Number two, imitate Jesus, model your life on his. And number three, forgive each other. Judgment is God's province, not our province. It turns out that those are also three of the core principles that a liberal democracy needs to function. So don't be afraid maps onto, you know what, this next election is not the apocalypse. Don't be afraid of sometimes losing in politics. You won't always win. It's not the end of the world. Your time will come, and in the meantime, you might learn something, but have some trust in your fellow citizens. Don't approach your fellow citizens in the spirit of alarm and fear, because that will lead to hate. And that's exactly where we are right now. Precept number two, be like Jesus. So Jesus and the liberal tradition, all people are created equal and free, are very closely related. And of course, that's no surprise, because the originators of classical liberalism, John Locke, Immanuel Kant, all those people, they were Christians. So Jesus is an egalitarian. He believes in the equal worth and dignity of every single human being, because all are made in the image of God. And he believes that humans should always be treated as ends in themselves, never just as means to an end. And he believes that society is judged by how we treat the least of these, the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed. He sides with those people. You see, all of those principles come directly over into the liberal tradition in the form of the protection of minority rights, which is wired into our Constitution, the equality in the Declaration of Independence, the fact that everyone gets the same vote, and the core idea that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity in civil society, and no one is just a means to an end. It wouldn't matter if I could save 5 people's lives by shooting someone in the head, I still couldn't do it. And then there's the third precept, and that's forgive each other. So this one, I don't think it translates quite as explicitly, but there is a very similar and also foundational idea in liberal democracy, and that's the idea of forbearance, compromise, toleration. So sometimes you win an election. Well, the purpose of winning an election is not to crush the other side, salt the soil with their tears, and beat them forever. When you win, you forbear. You understand that you're going to share the country with the people who you beat, and you're going to treat them with the kind of respect and dignity and observe their rights the way you'll want to be treated when they're in charge. That too, that is absolutely fundamental to running a democracy. So I look at this, at those 3 precepts of Christianity. I talked to pastors and theologians. They all said, yep, that's it. It's those 3. Well, some would add repentance, but they said those are the core 3 things. And I look at our liberal democracy and I say to Christians, to my Christian friends, I'm not just making a generic defense of religion that, society just needs more religion. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying society needs more of what Christianity is based on, and that's the teachings of Jesus. And I'm saying the crisis in Christianity right now, which has spilled over and become a crisis for our democracy, is that so much of white Protestantism has moved away from the teachings of Jesus and in support of, for example, idolizing a public figure who, instead of saying, forgive each other, says, I am your retribution. A figure who talks about human beings as vermin, a figure whose core promise again and again made to Christians is, if you vote for me, I will give you power. And in exchange for that, I will demand and get loyalty. If you remember your Bible study when you were a kid, Jesus gets baptized, and then he goes into the wilderness for 40 days. And there, Satan meets him. And Satan tempts him with a deal and takes him to the mountaintop, shows him the entire world, and says, I will give you all of that if you will bow down and worship me. And you know what happens, right? Does Jesus take that deal? The answer is, of course not. He says, Satan, get thee behind me. Go away. He rejects that deal. So all I'm really asking is, hey, Christians, maybe try a little more Christianity.
That's so well said. And I'm gonna repeat, I am agnostic. I also believe that these three core, and I probably didn't ever like phrase them in the way you phrase them, but I did believe that there are things that Jesus provides and the teachings of what he provides that are so powerful and that can be so influential nowadays, even beyond the current Christians who claim that they are Christians. I mean, people in general can take a lot from these. I mean, the idea of don't be afraid. I mean, I took it a step beyond. It's like don't lose hope on a better society. I mean, I know people are kind of being a lot very downtrodden with the current administration, but I mean, we can't just give up. That just allows them to kind of do what they do, and you have to be able to still get out there, not be afraid to make change. Of course, imitate Jesus. I mean, he's the embodiment of goodness. There's really nothing else to say beyond that. You ain't gonna see Jesus do anything wrong, right? People love to pick on wrongful action on so many figures throughout history. Of course, they'll criticize, Martin Luther King. I know there's a big controversy with him potentially cheating on his wife. And they're trying to make it seem like he's not that great of a person. And there's plenty of historical figures. I'm not going to go down that and give people ammo. I'm not going to do all that. So that's when it comes to Jesus, you ain't going to find that. He's the epitome of goodness. So you want to do your best to kind of resemble that. And of course, forgiveness. I mean, that's probably one of the most powerful things you can think of because we ain't going to have compromise without forgiveness. So everything was articulated very well. And I do think are very important values that people should adopt within themselves. And it's funny that you mentioned this stuff in regards to like how Christians or people who claim to be Christians are idolizing a certain political figure. And I'm gonna have to bring up these examples because they're kind of ridiculous. And if you would have told this to a Christian maybe a decade ago, they would say blasphemy. You're a harlot, like something. When people are saying if Jesus Christ was aligned with the left side, I would still support Donald Trump. Crazy. When people were saying or making up songs calling Donald Trump the second coming, crazy. I'm not religious, and even I think it's crazy that people are saying this about Donald Trump. I'm like, y'all forget who Jesus Christ is? I mean, I don't know. Maybe you did. Maybe you haven't been to church for a while. So it's kind of insane. I do want to kind of touch upon that a little bit more. When it comes to, like you said, the current way that the Protestants and the people who are quote unquote religious on the right are using politics in their way to influence people, and the way even Donald Trump used it in his administration, calling out to the Christians and tell them to go vote and that they're going to save Christianity. When it comes to trying to reach out to these people, I know you brought up the core teachings, but maybe you can go into a little bit more depth with this. These people are definitely hold Donald Trump in a very high standard. What is the best way to communicate? What is the best way to reach out to them, to maybe bring them back to the core teachings in a way that makes them feel enlightened or make them enlightened to what is supposed to be Christianity? If you're an average person and you're trying to talk to this person, how do you recommend they approach these type of people?
Well, that's such an important question. Can I do my overcomplicating things again and give you two types of answers? The first is the big picture answer, and the second is the small bore answer that you can walk out the door and use today. So I'm going to give them both to you. So on the big civic level, the question about if Christians can help heal our democracy, and by the way, I think help stanch the bleeding in their own church, as a lot of people don't want to go to the church for politics and the culture war, and that seems to be one of the reasons so many people are fleeing. So if we want to fix that, what needs to be addressed is the absence of what can be called a civic theology. So that needs just a bit of explaining, and if you don't mind, I will. So Christians have been white Protestants are still pretty darn good when it comes to discipling people, or spiritual formation is called. That's making Christians in the image of Christ in how they act in their lives. Still pretty good at that in family, church, community. When there's a hurricane, the churches are great, but that's in their own immediate sphere. There has not been the development in Protestantism, white Protestantism, of a civic theology which asks the question, so how does Jesus want us to behave in our political lives and on social media? So that's the public square, right? There's a writer, an evangelical named David French, who's put this very well. And he says that Christianity is a seamless garment. It governs Christians' entire lives, not just the personal part. And he says, it won't do to say, I may be a bit of an asshole on Twitter, but you should see me in the soup kitchen. He said that doesn't work. But there's a big hole in Christianity where civic theology should be that disciples people into how they should relate in the civic sector. And the result of that vacuum is that it's sucked in all of these alternatives that are apocalyptic, fearful, often religious in structure, like radical wokeness on the left and MAGA QAnon on the right. These kind of pseudo-religions, which encourage people to behave in intolerant ways and hyper-partisan ways, angry and fearful ways. And that's part of what's driving our country to division and distraction right now. So in the big picture, what needs to happen is the construction of a Christian civic theology that begins doing the work of discipling people into our Republican virtues. And there's some material in the book about who's doing that. A lot of Christians have come to realize that this is a hole that needs to be filled. They're doing that work, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is perhaps the leading example of that. So I promised also the small bore news you can use, and here it is. This is the personal answer. This is Jonathan and Riddell talking right now about what we can do today. And the answer is, if you want to have that conversation with someone that you disagree with and think is profoundly wrong and maybe even dangerous to our country, go have a conversation with them and start it with this question. What is it about your life experience that led you to your opinion? What is it about your life experience that brought you to believe what you believe? This is scientifically proven to be a bridge building question. It's also the founding question of Braver Angels, which is a grassroots depolarizing movement that I'm an evangelist for, former board member of. What that question does, it's kind of a Christ-like question, because it encourages people, instead of hitting them with, you're wrong, I think you're wrong, here's why, you're shifting the ground to curiosity and connection. What is it about your life? So you're showing interest in them as a person. And you're switching, something Jesus did, of course, famously. You're switching from debating fact to talking about story, about narrative, about parable. And humans are natural storytellers. We're much more natural at stories than debating facts. So if you just go out there and do that, you will be surprised how often you can find something to talk about and bond over with someone you think is profoundly wrong, and maybe have some influence over their opinion of you, and maybe introduce in their mind the idea, there may be other people who are good with different opinions. Maybe it makes them curious.
All right. I mean, I do think that sounds like a very useful strategy that people can implement. That said, one final topic, and then we'll start wrapping up the show. Because we addressed quite a bit in this one, and I'm curious on your thoughts about the anti-Christian bias department that Donald Trump is trying to create. Now, I haven't looked into too much depth, and I would have to kind of compare, because, of course, the argument initially will be like, if I posted something like this on social media, what did you think about when Joe Biden did anti-Semitism and anti-Islamophobia movements? What I would argue there is, did Joe Biden create departments there? So that's why I would have to look into it in the government for these things. Or was it he just making it an agenda to ensure that society and obviously due punishment is implemented for the increased amount of anti-Semitism and anti-Islamophobia from the Israel and Palestinian war? So I'd have to kind of see into that. Because from my perspective, from what it seems like, is Donald Trump is creating a whole entire department in the government purely made for anti-Christian bias. Obviously, he's putting his U.S. Attorney General, who is very loyal to him, and Bondi in charge of it. And it seems to me that we're starting to integrate religion into government from the surface, at the very least, from my current understanding. So I'm curious on your thoughts. Are you aware of this going on? Or if you're not, in general, what do you think about this idea?
So I've read the same news accounts you have, and there's not enough detail yet, at least not enough detail that I know, but I think not enough detail that anyone knows to understand what it is the administration might or might not do about in this thing about anti-Christian or anti-religious bias. They can't create a department, or at least until January 20th, from the dawn of the republic to January 20th, they couldn't. That would take an act of Congress. But, this president claims to have the powers of a monarch. And so I have no idea what they will wind up with. And in the first term, the pattern was, they would make these very grand promises and be very symbolic and make as much noise as they possibly could and dunk on the liberals, and then not much would really happen. And maybe that'll happen again. So we'll have to see. Getting some altitude, though, Riddell, over your question, I think really the more important part of your question is, so I have dunked a lot on white evangelical church in our conversation. I think they've made a catastrophic mistake of letting their church become politicized and secularized, too much aligned with partisan politics, with fear, with culture wars, and with power in this world. So I'm pretty hard on them. But there's another section of the book which is an apology that I make to Christians. And that apology is that I think, like a lot of secular Americans, in fact, probably like most secular Americans, on a good day, I neglected faith as a part of the American tapestry. I paid no attention to it. 22 years ago, in the dumbest article I ever wrote, I celebrated the decline of faith in America because I thought faith is dogmatic and divisive. So without it, we'll all be happier. And boy, was I wrong about that. So I think that people like me were negligent on a good day. And on a bad day, we were kind of outright adversarial or hostile to people of faith, especially on the progressive left. You would see people, for example, saying that they wanted to use the powers of the federal government to require every baker in America to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding. And that struck me as unwise, as just too extreme, not making enough room for people to exercise their faith when we could find ways to make exceptions, reasonable exceptions, narrow exceptions, but ways for those little mom and pop bakeries to observe their faith without losing their business. So my book actually ends with a plea to people like me, which is we need to be more cognizant of the important job, the important role that faith and specifically Christianity have to play in our society. We need to be more willing to make accommodations wherever we can, where it's reasonable in law. I say that as a gay person, and I'm married, and I'm very happy to be married, and I very much regret all the religious opposition to that. But that said, I don't need every single bakery in the country, regardless of size and status, to bake a cake for me. I think that's asking too much. I think we should be more curious and interested in religion. It wouldn't hurt us to go to church with a friend every now and then. I think programs in workplaces and universities about diversity and inclusion in the right sense. I don't mean quotas and all that stuff. I just mean making people feel welcome. That should include people of faith. And until now, it hasn't. And there are a lot of people of faith in a lot of workplaces who don't really talk about their faith because they think maybe it'll make them seem a little weird. I'm not saying they're oppressed or anything like that, or that there's a war on Christmas. That's just not true. But I am saying that we could do more to make people of faith feel like they could just talk about their faith at work, and that would be something that we'd be very acceptive of and even welcoming of. So, yeah, at 30,000 feet, I don't think a government department to like bear down on people in some rough way is going to solve it. But I think an attitudinal change of secular Americans to be more solicitous of and welcoming to people of faith. I think that's really important.
Right. Yeah, very much agree. I think there's a lot of great points that you made in regards to how people should kind of engage with religious people because there's obviously bad and good people on the religious side, but don't forget there's good people. Just because I use the word bad doesn't mean there's not good people. So I'm very much with you there. And throughout my agnostic journey, like I said, I've met a lot of religious people. My uncle is a pastor, so I mean, and I have a good relationship with my uncle and my aunt. We're both very religious. So with that said, hope everybody enjoyed today's podcast episode. You can find the information for John in the link in the podcast description. If you enjoyed today's podcast episode, feel free to rate it 5 stars. If you want to contact me, have a conversation, feel free to email me, thetrentgoldenfaith@gmail.com, and you can follow on my socials as well. Anything else before we wrap it up on your end?
Well, just thanks for having me on the show and hearing what I had to say.
Yeah, no problem. It was a great conversation. Not often do I talk about religion in depth, so this was a very interesting one. With that said, hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. Y'all have a good one. Take care.